Holbrook Travel is pleased to be bringing you this webinar today, Imagining Our Earth in a New World, an Earth Day panel discussion. We're joined today by panelists from Holbrook's community who come from a variety of different backgrounds, including education, climate science, conservation, tourism, art. They'll each be bringing their own unique experience and expertise to the conversation today as they discuss some of the possibilities that they envision for sustainability in our future. So we're very excited to have them joining us. We'll just go over some brief opening remarks, and then our panelists will share in a guided discussion moderated by Andrea Holbrook. Toward the end, like I mentioned, we'll open it up for questions from the audience. So at any point during the conversation you'd like to submit a question, please do, and we'll share those at the end. So now I'd like to go ahead and introduce our panelists today. Our first panelist is Mariah Tanger, who is an author, professor, and sustainability consultant. Mariah lectures on sustainability strategies at Boston University's Questrom School of Business. She's also the co-host of the Climate Minute, a podcast through Massachusetts Climate Action Network. And she is co-author of the book, Protecting the Planet, Environmental Champions from Conservation to Climate Change. Mariah coordinated environmental programs for many years at Genzyme Corporation. And she has led individuals and teams in environmental stewardship and education in both corporate and nonprofit settings. She holds a master's degree in sustainability and environmental management from Harvard University Extension School and a bachelor's degree in biology with a minor in environment and human values from Trinity College. We're also joined today by Gregory Miller, who is the executive director of the Center for Responsible Travel, or CREST. Greg is responsible tourism advocate and trained environmental scientist. He joined CREST in 2019, bringing to the organization a global track record of results in sustainable travel and recreation, biodiversity conservation, and policy development. Prior to working at CREST, he worked as a global consultant, providing expertise and leadership on projects focused on biodiversity, conservation, climate change, corporate social responsibility, and ecotourism. And before that, he was president and CEO of NatureServe, and also previously served for 12 years as president of the American Hiking Society. He also led a distinguished 16-year executive career as vice president for the Andes Southern Cone region at the Nature Conservancy. Our next panelist is David Godfrey, who is CEO of the Sea Turtle Conservancy. David has been involved professionally in environmental conservation for over 25 years. Since 1993, he has been focused on sea turtle and coastal habitat issues. David has authored numerous articles and papers on environmental matters with an emphasis on coastal protection and sea turtles. He has participated in numerous sea turtle research projects and has written and/or narrated numerous documentaries and videos pertaining to sea turtle and coastal conservation issues. During his tenure with the SDC, he led the effort to establish Florida's Sea Turtle Specialty License Plate, which is now the main funding source for sea turtle protection in Florida. And lastly, we're joined by Mindy Lighthype, who is a natural history illustrator, author, and art instructor. Mindy is an artist whose work depicts the beauty of the natural world and shows the interconnection of plants, insects, birds, and mammals. She's passionate about protecting the earth, and she does so by educating people through her art. Since 1999, Mindy has taught hundreds of budding artists through the New York Botanical Garden, the University of Florida, and numerous specialty courses throughout the US, Europe, and Central America, as well as through online courses. She currently teaches scientific illustration at the University of Florida, and she has exhibited her art since 1998 in juried and solo exhibitions. In 2009, she received a silver medal from the Royal Horticulture Society in London, and in 2010, she had a solo exhibition at the Florida Museum of Natural History. I'll also just briefly mention Al Stenstrup, who was scheduled to join us today. Unfortunately, he was not able to make it. So we are sorry to miss him, but hope to do him service in our conversation today. And our moderator today is Andrea Holbrook. Andrea is the president and CEO of Holbrook Travel. She also serves on the boards of Selva Verde Lodge and Rainforest Reserve and the Sarapiquí Conservation Learning Center, both in Costa Rica, as well as on the board of the Center for Responsible Travel. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Mariah. Welcome, Mariah, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, and thank you for that lovely introduction, Lindsay. So I spend my time trying to get people engaged and interested in climate change issues via some of my lectures at Boston University, my podcast, my book, and talks such as this. And I'm singularly driven toward communicating about the climate crisis and how we can address it. But this interface between COVID-19 and the climate effects is hard to wrap my head around. It's a gut-wrenching reality check, as me and Chris said so it's thoughtfully in her New York Times article recently. And I'm sort of trying to figure out how to talk to my students about it. And one of my big concerns, and the thing that drives me to figure out how to communicate about climate change, was always that my children would inherit a hostile environment where they couldn't interact with the outdoors for fear of disease or increased disease vectors like ticks or mosquitoes, or inhospitable conditions such as extreme storms or fire or floods. But that fear always seemed very far off. But one of the things that COVID has shown us is that the world can shift seismically with a moment's notice, and everything that we cared about can be yanked from underneath us, which is both a reminder that we should cherish what we have and also a reminder that we should fight for it. And so I look at this as a chance to recreate and reimagine the world in ways that we want to see. And I'm looking forward to talking with the panelists today to try and do that, hopefully.
Thank you so much, Mariah. Sorry about that. My microphone was muted, and thanks, Greg, for pointing that out for me. I so appreciate your being able to be here as sustainability expert and someone who is an author in a book on climate science, and who's just very informed in this area. I really at Holbrook, as we were starting to think about Earth Day and what is the best way that we could talk about Earth Day in the midst of a pandemic, it seemed that there's this tremendous contrast, of course, because we're in a humanitarian crisis at this point, and we have the entire world is sort of on lockdown, and we're seeing these images of wildlife that is coming out of hiding in some way, and we're seeing whether it's in Costa Rica, pictures of bobcats or, felines out, on the road because there's no traffic. And so we just wanted to start this conversation and really talk about these contrasts. So one of the things that Dave, in this COVID-19 pandemic, has really highlighted the importance of the relationship between humans and wildlife. And given your experience with sea turtle conservation, what do you feel are the most important lessons that we need to learn in terms of improving the relationship between humans and wildlife?
Well, one of the things I find myself thinking about is that our organization and many others that advocate for wildlife have been trying to encourage people to modify their behavior in order to protect the world around them, particularly wildlife. And in our case, we're obviously focused on sea turtles. And so things like our behavior on the beach at night, or how we drive boats in the water, whether we light up our homes on important nesting beaches, all of these decisions have real life and death ramifications for sea turtles. And this pandemic is causing people to actually sort of inadvertently adhere to a lot of the things we've been asking people to do for decades. And you're seeing some of those, and we expect to see it throughout the nesting season, which is really just getting underway now. But we expect to see a lot of increased survivorship of sea turtles that can be measured in the coming months, just like we're seeing other types of wildlife respond to changes in human behavior. So I think one of the most important lessons we can learn is that, the things that you can do, the decisions you make about your behavior really do have an impact in an immediate way on wildlife. And this time that we're in gives people a chance to see that through the images that are coming in from around the world of wildlife doing all kinds of interesting things in our absence, and know that you really do have an individual role that you can play going forward in the protection and recovery of imperiled species. So there's a lot of positive, I think, that can come out of this, and hopefully people will think about these things for the long term. It's certainly one of the messages our organization is going to be trying to get out there post coronavirus. What do we do with this knowledge and experience?
Thank you, David. One of the questions that was submitted before the webinar today, which really came to the fore when we had our meeting yesterday in preparation, is what is really about economics and growth. And so I'll just ask Mariah perhaps if she could address this. How do you think it will be possible to use this current experience to shift our collective thinking and pursue a new economic model, not based on ceaseless growth, but focusing rather on important goods and services and approaching true environmental sustainability? Are there ways to try and broach these two things at the same time? Are they forever doomed to just be in contradiction to each other?
I definitely
just
think
a small question for you there, Mara.
Can you solve all the world's problems in
yes.
5 seconds or less? I am no expert in this, of course, but I've read. Eric Holthouse wrote a fantastic article for the Correspondent, and he outlined a three-part plan to get long-term thinking into our short-term crisis recovery. And the three big pieces of this are to then nationalize the fossil fuel and airline industries, to invest in public works projects on an enormous scope and scale, and to strengthen social safety nets. And I think that this plan, there's a lot of good wisdom there. The idea behind nationalizing the fossil fuel and airline industries are that the government would purchase majority shares in these big polluting industries, while those shares are inexpensive. And then that sort of makes the citizens the largest majority shareholder, and we can force these industries to become nonprofits and to slowly transition into renewable energy. They're no longer, well, they're accountable to their shareholders, but that's us, right? And the investing in public works projects on an enormous scope and scale. The second part of his proposal is that the long-term interest rates are really very low right now. So there's money available for these public works projects. And one of the big tragedies of this coronavirus crisis is that we're going to have a lot of people who have lost their jobs. And so these new public works projects could both open a whole series of new jobs, retrofitting buildings, giving no interest loans to cities to build new sewer systems, closing down leaky gas lines and laying new pipes for geothermal energy, retrofitting homes. All of these things are jobs that are reasonably, I mean, some of them take more training than others, but there's certainly a very big arena for people to access jobs there. And so that's a great way to transition from a tough spot into a spot that would be both good for the economy and good for the renewable energy economy. So, and then the final point, to strengthen social safety nets. A while ago, Andrew Yang floated this idea. I've heard it before. I think actually President Obama was in favor of this as well, but for a universal basic income. And it was sort of kind of crazy at first, but it's actually starting to take hold. I think even President Trump has been mentioning it. So having these social safety nets like a universal basic income and declaring necessities such as healthcare, housing, and jobs that are as a human right, and making sure that all people have access to those. And in many ways, the coronavirus has shown us that those are not out of reach in the near term. Setting up that kind of stuff up is not so unattainable.
We've certainly seen that. Sorry to interrupt you.
No.
Some of the price tags of the government programs that have been the Paycheck Protection Program and others have been, the largest kinds of bills that have been passed in record time. And you just, as you say, some of these things were unthinkable before. These amounts were just, it's hard to see them, you know, in context because I don't actually know the larger picture. So what does $2 trillion mean? But there are these amounts that are so just almost on a scale we've never seen before. And so you have to wonder if this had been applied to healthcare, you know, which has been such a crisis for decades in our country. You know, is it possible that we would be looking at a different reality right now? And so why is, you know, it's very hard for, I think, right, for it to be, instead of reactive, to be proactive. But I guess that's what you're really alluding to, right, is just rethinking the whole model.
Yeah, and I think the beauty of this is that we've all changed our lives precipitously in order to protect other people, right? And I think that's a beautiful thing. And it shows that we're willing to do these hard things for the good of the community, for the good of the world. And so I think these are challenges we could take up.
Yes, I agree. It's sort of like, well, if this is possible, what else is possible, right? And all these things that we were previously thinking would never happen, suddenly we're all doing it. You know, we're all collectively pausing. It's almost unthinkable, right? It's certainly something that none of us, not even our parents, have any experience with. So just sort of taking in the unprecedented scale of it is mind-blowing. So thank you for that. And I apologize in advance for giving you the most difficult question. Mindy, you've spent your life documenting, you know, wildlife, documenting the, you know, flora and fauna of our world, and sharing that with students. You know, I think if there's one thing that, you know, we'd like to see is just a different perspective, and art sometimes approaches things from a very different perspective. So as an artist and educator, what's your perception of the role of art and or culture in moving this discussion forward in terms of sustainability?
Thanks, Andrea, and thank you for having me here. I really feel like art is essential, and it's interesting. I mean, of course, I would feel that way, but at the same time, I think that a lot of times when there's budgets or there's concerns fiscally, that, you know, we end up losing funding and whatnot. But I've also found that at the time when people feel a sense of despair or not being connected to either nature or other people like we have been, there's been an outpouring. I've had a huge outpouring during this time where I've connected with students all over the world, which is really cool. I have students in Japan and Australia, and I've been doing a lot of work online. And there are also a lot of resources that, you know, blending technology along with nature. You know, so for instance, there's a bird count today from, I think it's like eBird or Cornell, where, you know, it's like, what's in your backyard? And they're iNaturalist, you start recording things. And so for me, you know, the best thing for me is to get outside, and I'm limited as to where I can go, but it's not that I can't go places. I mean, just for instance, I just watched a baby dove, a baby ground dove, fall out of the nest and survive. And every day she's been like there, and I've been totally immersed in that. And I'm going to draw her because it's really important that she's like special. And I think that what ends up happening is that there's curiosity in your backyard right now. And as we begin to filter out and go out a little bit further, I mean, I never really looked at a ground dove with any affection, but now it's super meaningful to me. And being able to record that is important. I also have had a student that I'd never met before who solicited me, who's a musician. And she created a piece for her college composition class and found my work on the internet. And it was about her friend Pedro, who was from Brazil, found a painting of mine and asked if she could use it in her album cover. And I was like, absolutely. And so now I have this connection with this woman, this young woman I've never met before. And I feel like this is a way of globally connecting music, art, dance, communication. And, you know, we never had that before. And I think being driven inside, it's like we're thirsty to connect. We're thirsty to be with other people, even though we're not allowed to be. And I think that that is one of the things that is hopefully will continue, you know, that a little piece of my paradise I share and I continue to explore now until I can, you know, I can get out and go more, you know, to Costa Rica and, you know, all places that I love. But for right now, I think that slowly and being mindful about protecting what we have right here in our backyard is kind of, it's been a real treat for me. You know, I overlooked a lot of stuff.
Thank you, Mindy. And maybe you can comment a little on the role that you see that art has in terms of getting people aware or to care, I guess. That's a question, right? Because we sort of talked about the fact that in today's modern world, we're very isolated and, well, aside from the COVID isolation, I mean, we live in a world in which we have very little connection with our food, very little connection, in some cases, no connection to the outdoors. And so how do you see art playing a role in that?
Well, I think that, you know, one of the things is that drawing is a wonderful way of learning. And we were talking about how do you know, how can you communicate? And I think that, you know, there's a big surgence of people that do sketchbooks and journaling. And I think that when you find something that you haven't seen before or you didn't notice was there before and you start to draw it, then all of a sudden you're looking at observation skills, you're looking at it more closely. The more you look, the more you see, the more you become curious and the more you care about what you're looking at. So, you know, as I said, like just to use the little dove, I mean, I see them all the time and I've never really thought much of them except that it fell out of the nest. And then all of a sudden it became important to me. And I had a sense of curiosity and wonder about it and started sketching it and started watching it every single day. And actually at one point I climbed out of a window into my courtyard so that I could photograph it to get a little bit closer. You know, and that's the kind of thing where curiosity brings hope. Curiosity brings wonder. It's like, what is going on? And now all of a sudden, a bird that I've seen probably my whole entire life, I'm
Right.
now super curious about.
Now you're connected.
I'm absolutely connected to it. And I think that that's a way of, you know, working with children or adults. When you draw things, you all of a sudden you're like, what am I really looking at? Right. You know, and the more you look, the more you see, the more you want to know. And then the more you care about what your surroundings are like. So I think that, you know, of course, everyone should go out and get a sketchbook or even just a sheet of paper and just start drawing. Draw your food.
Thank you, Mindy. I think you probably inspired, I know you inspired Mariah yesterday. So,
Right.
Another question that we had from our audience, and I just thank everyone very much for their submission of questions. And this one it's really relevant and important for Holbrook, certainly for CREST, the Center for Responsible Travel, and everyone in the travel industry right now. And it goes to Greg, which is, how can we help countries that now increasingly depend on ecotourism given the reduction in travel? And what's to stop them from reverting to practices that destroy rather than protect the natural environment in search of economic stability or gain?
Yeah, thank you, and happy Earth Day to everybody. 50 years is a pretty big deal, and I think we should all be very proud of that. This is something that really forms one of the major underpinnings at CREST in terms of looking at science or evidence-based solutions to addressing sustainable tourism. And in particular, what I want to emphasize with everybody is just how important the travel and tourism industry is to the global economy. And it covers all factors within most countries. In fact, there's 127 countries on the globe that depend on tourism, travel and tourism for a major portion of their economy. And almost 90 of them depend on foreign currency as their principal exchange earner. And you put those two together and then add the third, that 1 in 10 employees in the world, 1 in 10 jobs in the world are in travel and tourism. It's the biggest employer. And so what we're seeing now is you take a look at that and you see, I'm not saying that all of these countries and locations are necessarily working at the best practices and sustainable, but we have an extraordinary experience-based economic model going on in most of the countries we see it, especially ones that are developed around, experience, tourism. And the United States is one of those countries. It's a huge economic driver, the travel, tourism, and hospitality. And I say that not just from an economic sense, but from a conservation perspective, from protecting cultural resources and even spiritual resources across the nation and the globe. And so what we're seeing now, when the COVID pandemic began, the industry that was impacted immediately, the sectors, were travel and tourism, because people stopped moving. And obviously that has an important factor for the individuals who are traveling. But when we look at the important dependence on the experience economy, which is tourism, and you look at so many countries and places, including all those gateway communities in the United States, in and around protected areas, national parks, et cetera, this has been a real game changer. And your question is spot on, because what we are generally worried about, and we all should be worried about, is that this is going to destabilize experience-based economies, to where rather than looking at a more sustainable model of managing experiences, whether it's natural resources, cultural, or even spiritual places of which people travel to visit, we're going to see potentially a very disastrous shift from an experience economy to a more extraction-based one, with unsustainable practices, slash and burn, logging, and something that David was mentioning briefly before, and something we're all aware of with COVID-19, is the all-important human-animal interface. And with increased habitat fragmentation, et cetera, we have a real issue with that. And that is one of the big drivers and one of the unifying themes that we see between COVID-19 and looking at the longer term threat of climate change. But from an economic sense, coming back again, we need to think about the following, that the travel and tourism industry has so been built around this experience-based economy that there is a genuine looming risk that it's going to change, and the crisis is going to turn into what I call kind of a frenzied eat what you kill mentality. And let me explain what I mean by that. We're seeing right now in the United States, for example, during COVID-19, unfortunately, the administration is relaxing, the US administration is relaxing a number of important environmental regulations and other important checks and balances to protect air, water quality, et cetera, and endangered species. This is a huge problem. What we in the US, now what we're seeing in more fragile based countries, Costa Rica is a good example, where Andre, you of course have one of your lodges there. Even that country, which depends so much on tourism, there's been a virtual collapse there. Now, if there's a return or almost a pendulum swing from a more sustainable experience-based model to this extractive and destructive and unsustainable one, we see a real threat that any business is good business when things open up. And this is a very real problem, whether it's visitation to the US national parks, going to Monteverde in Costa Rica, or visiting the cruise industry, re-engaging. And actually, it is very possible that we will see an even more intensified impacts related to over-tourism in some places, worse than what we saw before, because there's an overcompensation of desire to rebuild their coffers,
Right.
their economies, and also to, as a
Right.
result, then to turn a blind eye to important environmental and cultural.
I mean, I can
nuance.
certainly, Greg, speak to what you're saying. I mean, it is true. Salvo Verde right now is empty. There is nobody
I'm
there.
sure.
There hasn't been anybody there since March 21st. We had the last couple leave. And you know, the only people in and out of Costa Rica are people basically repatriating, you know, to their various homes. And the Costa Ricans are currently trying to, at least the hoteliers, from what I can gather, have been putting a lot of high hopes on national tourism, on the Costa Rican market, trying to sort of seeing that as what will maybe come back a little bit sooner and will be what sort of starts to reignite, you know, the economic engine there.
Yeah.
But I think that, you know, you really pose a huge question, which is, you know, if it does take much longer than, you know, than we're thinking. And that's a very real possibility. I think, you know, we're seeing that in the news that, you know, there's a lot of unknowns and uncertainties. So in that situation, what, you know, what can be done, and people need to eat. So I guess I just open it up a little bit, perhaps, to the other panelists, Mariah, David, you know, Mindy, if you have questions or thoughts in terms of what, you know, how to support countries that, you know, that right now are really looking at a very, very tough choices and very, very difficult scenarios. So what can be done that doesn't shift the pendulum
Andrea, could I just add one quick point?
Sure.
And that is, you know, so much of the tourism activity we see in a number of these countries I'm referencing pay significant and very important tourism fees that support conservation of biodiversity, and of course, cultural resources. We are seeing right now a disturbing uptick in poaching and in intrusions in protected areas, where these are the jewels in the crown of the economy of many countries, let alone we're seeing the poaching of very threatened and endangered species right now. And the illegal wildlife trade is starting to heat up in ways. So there's a multiplier effect. My point in this is, all the listeners, your travel supports conservation in a great measure, whether it's conservation of nature or conservation of cultural or even spiritual sites. So that's something that's an important element in this economic question.
Thank you, Gregory. Yes.
I just wanted to add that.
Just to piggyback on, you know, this doesn't quite answer your question, Andrea, but Greg's point about the pendulum swinging, I think, is definitely something to be very aware of. I know there's precedent for that. In the 2008 financial crisis in China, there was a significant reduction of emissions, but then after that crisis, once they kind of got back on their feet, emissions didn't just catch back up to what they had been, they were worse, right? So I think that as far as climate change and climate impact goes, we do have to be on our guard that once we can go back out into the world and start purchasing, start interacting with the world, it may be sort of we can finally do it, let's stock up, let's prepare for the apocalypse. You know, there may be that pendulum swing in really great ways. And it's hard to know how to address what's going to hit other countries, except for that I think some of the key lessons from this are to listen and learn from each other. There was an article by Amy Davidson Sorkin where she discussed Kerala, which is one of the Indian states that's had the most success fighting coronavirus. It's led by a woman who they call the coronavirus slayer. And she came to this problem with knowledge of a former pandemic that she had to address. There was the Nipah virus, and that taught them a lot about how to address the pandemic. And so she knew how to go into this. And I think that listening to other countries who've had experience And learning from the ways that they've handled these things is critical in moving forward. So being open and working together is really one of the most important things we can do, I think, going forward.
Yeah, thank you. And I just wrote that down. Can you repeat her name? Amy Davidson Surkoff is?
Amy Davidson Sorkin wrote the article.
Thank
yep,
you.
Sorkin. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. That sounds really, really interesting. And I totally agree with you that it's so important to kind of compare notes and to know, you know, how other countries are addressing it. And, you know, in the case of Costa Rica, there's some hope on, you know, domestic tourism. I have one comment here from one of our audience members, and it's Clara from Italy, and she writes, Gregory, we've been hearing a lot about community-centered tourism as a potential way to start again after the corona crisis ends. What I've noticed is the most articles refer to this model being applied to developing countries and generally poorer ones. What do you think? Why do you think that is? And do you see this as a model for tourism in the United States, for example?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I hope everyone is doing well and improving in Italy, given the tremendous impact they had there. You know, when we look at community structure, historically, in tourism, people have very much looked at the rural community overseas, outside of the U.S. and elsewhere, or outside of the developed world into the more developing world, and seeing how you know, programs can be developed and they direct benefit. But the fact is, and I've spent many years working with gateway communities in and around the protected areas, the national parks and reserves in the United States, as well as just overall communities that provide that direct service and have the contact with that tourist destination, wherever it is. And I think this question is spot on, because that's where I think in a post-COVID recovery, we can see a real responsible recovery where it's community-based, focusing on good practices and ensuring that there's an equitable and full distribution of wealth when tourism regains its foothold. And I think in the case of Italy, for example, I think you have very interesting contrast between where there's tremendous benefits to communities when people come and stay overnight and have multi-day visits to wherever it is, a rural or you know, an urban community. But you see a very different impact when it comes to, like, the cruise ships that come into Venice or elsewhere, other parts of Europe, where it's like 1/7 of the economic impact, positive impact. So I think this is coming back to the question. I think community-based tourism needs to really focus on what kind of tourism do the communities want to support. Mm-hmm. And we would certainly promote, and very much, the kind of responsible recovery, responsible tourism that's focused around quality rather than quantity. That I think the communities can, and this could go anywhere in the world, rural, urban communities, big and small, that they set the right benchmarks and say, this is what will be acceptable, and this is what we want our future to be and to look like. And I think we're going to see we hope and expect to see a very strong level of self-governance and choice being made by community-based tourist efforts. And that's why the whole concept of destinations and destination stewardship and governance is of such primary importance, because it really will redistribute wealth as well around the needs of communities. So that's a terrific question. I'm glad, Andrea, you raised that.
Thank you, Gregory.
It's a really important element to the recovery that we're talking about.
And I would just add, if you spread that wealth around in those communities that are dependent on tourism, they're going to be more able to be resilient when unusual events like this happen. If everyone's just employed and making minimum wage, and you know, something like this happens, everyone's out of work, they don't have any accumulation of assets or resources to sustain themselves. But if the community is profiting across a wider margin, people hopefully are in a better capacity to withstand a short-term thing like we hope coronavirus is.
And I would say, David, that's really a terrific point. And what I think we're seeing now, and what we hope to see moving forward in a post-COVID-19 recovery, is that we see exactly that kind of adaptation and resilience in communities, such that this is I won't say a temporary, but this is a more short time period tragedy and crisis that if we learn and these communities really develop in this way, it will better prepare them for climate change impacts. Mm-hmm. And they will be tooled, they'll have the risk management capability, they'll have their priorities set straight, and they'll be developing a more resilient and sustainable economy as a result. There's actually exciting possibilities to really reset a new normal if we do it right. And so the question is terrific. It's really hitting to the heart of things.
Thank you. Thank you so much, David and Greg. Switching gears a little bit, one of our audience members requested or inquired about how we can incorporate more science instruction into elementary teacher preparation and bring science and project-based learning approach to schools. I think what this question is really getting at is the fact that we've seen so much, and it's arguable that science education is what is lacking. It's hard to understand what is behind, in a way, I would say, it's hard to understand if the science is so clear, why the public opinion and feeling around sustainability is so unclear. Maybe that's a larger question, but maybe let's approach both of those if we can. What do you feel is behind the fact that even though we know and understand these problems and what their results are, do you think it's a problem with knowing and understanding, or the will and interest in seeing change happen? I'll just sort of open that up to everybody.
I think it's human nature to, look for the easiest explanation or the explanation that causes you not to have to change your life very much. And so there's a willful denial of reality. I think back to, Al Gore's famous movie, which was so appropriately named. These are inconvenient truths about the world and our impact on the world, or climate change. And there's got to be a way to get people to recognize the immediacy and the importance and the reality of what scientists and science is telling us. That may be one of the things that could come out of this coronavirus, is people can see how quickly the world can so utterly change, and maybe learn from that. But anyway, that's just a quick thought.
Thank you. Yeah. Anyone else? You've got your mic muted, Gregory.
Yeah, I was just going to build on what David was saying. As a scientist myself, and have long worked on science or information-rich decision-making, I think we've really seen COVID-19 has exposed that what happens when you have good decisions in places that are made with competent leadership, evidence-based science or evidence-based information, and looking for the long term. We also see examples where evidence-based or science information is not used or discarded or dismissed, and we see the consequences of that. I think the general public overall is also recognizing that, because they are so hungry for information, especially now that it comes to their most fundamental well-being for themselves, family, loved ones, that some of the information's all over the map. So they really need to identify who those trusted sources of information are. What does competent or credible information look like, and how do you access it? And then how do you use it? And so I think people are going to really develop a better understanding of the difference between, really evidence-based information and just, kind of ad hoc
So you think
anecdotal.
you're in agreement with David that this
Yeah,
crisis
absolutely.
is sort of bringing that to the fore and helping
Absolutely.
people understand in a literal sense in real time.
I mean,
yeah, go ahead, Mariah.
So Yale Center for Climate Communication, I think, said it best, that in some ways the effects of coronavirus are like watching climate change unfold on fast forward. It's a compressed version of what scientists have been warning for decades. But I think a fundamental difference here is that it's the retirement problem, right? It's hard for people to save for retirement because it's really far away. It's much easier to save for the car you're going to buy next year, or to save for a new, an upgrade to your house, or you're, moving and buying a house or whatever it is. But coronavirus is something that's so much more immediate. So that's an easy science to grasp and to trust. Whereas the science for climate change, it's like retirement. It's very far off. It doesn't seem like something that you can connect with with such immediacy, and that makes it harder for people to, as Dave said, take those hard steps. And I think, Greg, as you kind of indicated, having people who are trusted messengers tell you is often holds more weight than a scientist. One of the biggest things that I tell my students and friends is that, the biggest thing you can do as an individual is not, sure, eating less meat, driving your car less, all of these things have a big impact. But the biggest thing you can do is talk about climate change and talk about the urgency and the need to deal with it, and to spread that message in a way that all of you become the trusted messengers for many people, and that causes a paradigm shift. And that paradigm shift puts pressure on governments, on businesses, on everyone around you to start making the kinds of changes that we need to start making system change.
Thank you, Mariah. I think we're probably getting close to the time to check in. Lindsay, do we have any audience questions at this point that we want to address?
Sure. So we do have one question, and then, as you said, I think maybe we can wrap it up with some final commentary. One question that we did receive, though, is in what ways can seemingly disparate disciplines or industries work together to make positive change in conservation and/or climate action?
Can you repeat that one more time, Lindsay?
Sure. So we have a lot of panelists from a broad variety of backgrounds in different industries, and the question has to do with how we can bring together seemingly disparate industries or disciplines to work together for positive change.
I'll take a stab. One of the things I think that's so important in that, because you have such you're talking about such a diverse array of sectors and perspectives and priorities, is to be clear on what success moving forward would look like. And we need to have almost a common currency within human society of what is truly important and what do we want to collectively work for. And I think we still have our work cut out for us to communicate the immediacy of climate change to the everyday person and now COVID-19 is clearly communicating that, and in painful ways. But I think it's incumbent on us to continue to redouble our efforts to find ways to make the existential threat of climate change be even more relevant to the decision makers, to individuals, and then have the kind of feedback loop between the recipients or stakeholders and those who are making decisions, so that they're listening to the right people and they're being held accountable. Right. But you have to have a common sort of, what is the prize? What is your vision for the future, and what do we agree on it?
I couldn't agree with you more.
Agree on that more, and
it
stems from leadership.
Yes.
Quite a bit, or the lack of leadership. I'm sorry to say. I don't mean to sound so political, but it really does make a difference.
Just go ahead.
Oh, okay. I mean, we don't have leadership.
That horse left the barn, I think.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we don't have the leadership today in the United States to focus on this. And and we definitely need it. And CREST
Yeah.
is not a political organization. I'm not talking about politics. I'm talking about competency and thinking strategically into the future. You have a good plan. You have a good leader at the helm or leadership.
Yeah, it can't be
Across
leader,
whatever.
leaders.
It's not a single.
Yes.
It's not a dictatorship or a kingdom,
Mm-hmm.
and it will be amazing what we can do, because you need to rally the troops. People
Right.
look for that trusted,
Right.
credible source of information.
Yeah, and that's
decisions.
what Mariah was talking
And
about
Mariah was spot on,
earlier,
yeah.
about
Absolutely.
the credible messenger and the credible
That's right.
communicator. And I think that's why Greta Thunberg's message resonated so much with me. It was sort of listening to some of her speeches where I understood something that was, deeply missing, which is the right people need to come forward with the right message. And I think that's really what we've been missing are those voices. And everybody, it's not that difficult. I mean, really, when the basic science, it does get very, very complicated with feedback loops and all this stuff, but it's really not that complicated to explain. And it can be done quite easily. I just don't know why it's not being explained. But
I would just add real quickly, if I can. I know we're running out of time, but I think I agree with that point. Leadership is critical. The right messenger is critical. But it also doesn't let us individuals or organizations like the Sea Turtle Conservancy off the hook to do what we can do now to promote those messages and try to bring different types of industries or sectors of our economy together. And examples of that are, the Sea Turtle Conservancy has some really interesting partnerships with industry that start as simple sponsorships where they want to be aligned with something that we do. But I take every one of those little partnerships and try to mold that into some kind of real tangible behavior or commitment made by that industry or that sector to do something positive for conservation or marine conservation, whatever it may be. So looking for different atypical alliances or partnerships from where you sit is an important thing. I mean, we're a sea turtle conservation group, and we have this great partnership with an eco travel agency in Holbrook, and we're working together now to get this messaging out. In Panama, STC has an unusual partnership with a mining company where we're doing mitigation work for impacts from this mine that are permitted and operating legally in the country, and they're going to be doing what they're doing whether we have a partnership or not. But it's like, hey, let's do things positive for sea turtle conservation if you're going to exist, and building a relationship that allows them to contribute to that. And so I think it's important for all of us to keep our eye out for ways that we can not just wait for leadership, but to champion some of those alliances ourselves.
To just back that up, I think that you're exactly right. I mean, we definitely have an individual role to play in terms of wildlife. And I think it's so important that we don't view ourselves as separate from nature, right? We're part of nature, and human activity that hurts the environment also hurts us. And you can see that in some ways in the coronavirus, as Greg referenced, how the destruction of climate of habitat is putting us closer to species, and that can create new problems with pandemics. But also just in the fact that if there's air pollution out there, we can't breathe, right? We need this clean air. And so I think that we're part of that system, and it's so important to remember that the things we are doing to animals, we are also doing to ourselves.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I want to thank you all so very much. Lindsay, I guess we wanted to wrap up, and I think where we were headed is we sort of thought it would be nice to end with a statement from each of us about something that we hoped for. Am I saying that correctly, Lindsay?
Yeah, I think we had hoped that we could have everyone kind of share what you hope for, what kind of ideal world do you envision in the future? What do you hope maybe comes out of this, or what might be an ideal scenario in your mind?
Okay, and who wants to go first?
I'll go first. I haven't said anything in a while.
Go for it, Mindy. Go for it.
Okay. You know, COVID-19 has been one response to Mother Earth's way of communicating with us. For me, you know, it's part of a warning that we need to protect all things. All living things are dependent on one another, and it's about global health. Our time spent in social distancing has given her the opportunity to breathe. So right now our air, the ocean, the waterways, they've all had relief from human impact. And, you know, we are all yearning and we're impatient to resume our normal lives. And in some ways I feel like we've been feeling entitled. And, you know, I'm hoping that, you know, we're not going to return, like, what will our new normal be? You know, my hope is that we begin to care more about people who are in need, for the unemployed, as well as vulnerable habitats. I mean, it's not just one or the other, it's everything. And my hope is that we open up our ears, our eyes, and our hearts to realize our vulnerability as a planet and listen to Mother Earth's important messages. I know collectively we can find sustainable ways and make this a better place for all. And as an artist and as an educator, nature has always been my go-to place. And it's where I find imagination, curiosity, and wonder, where I live and breathe. So.
Thanks, Mindy.
Welcome.
I can go next, if that's all right.
Sure.
So I've been thinking about this this question, which we were prompted with yesterday in a little pre-meeting, and I think the way I'll answer it is that I've studied a little bit of Native American history. I have some ancestry in a Native American bloodline, and so one of the things that I've learned about that is that, you know, a lot of different tribes or sectors of Native American history would make decisions based on the impact of that decision 7 generations down the line. And every decision was made, you know, big decisions about where they're going to live or what they're going to eat or how they're going to deal with some issue. How does that affect the 7th generation in the future? And in modern times, really what that is saying is thinking about others, thinking about people who aren't sitting there right there with you, and having some empathy and concern for how your decisions affect people in the future, your neighbor, people on the other side of the planet, and beyond just the next, you know, 10 minutes in time. And so I think my vision for the future is that this event, the coronavirus, causes people to begin to think about and take actions that are beyond their own self-interest and the immediacy of that action. What are the long-term ramifications? How does it affect the air and water around us, wildlife, people in developed countries, and begin to have some real empathy and action for others, which seems to be missing in our modern world and missing from some of our leadership. And I do mean that as a political statement.
Thank you, David.
I could jump in next. I just to pick up again on what Mindy was saying about that, you know, we can't return to normal. Greta Thunberg, who I honor very much, the Swedish climate activist, said that we can't return to normal because normal is a crisis. We already are in a crisis beyond just coronavirus. And of course, she's speaking of the climate crisis. And one of my favorite economists, Kate Raworth, talks about it, the donut economics, which is creating a safe operating space for all of humanity, where we're working within the planet's natural limits, which is the outer boundary of the donut, protecting resources and making sure that they're there for those seven generations, as Dave mentioned, but also ensuring that marginalized communities do not fall behind. They don't fall into the middle of that empty donut, right, into the donut hole. And I think this crisis has shown us, I think we've poignantly felt the importance of the caregiving professions, those who teach our children, who care for the sick and elderly, who bring beauty to our lives through art and inspiration, who take care of animals and show people the world. And I think valuing those contributions to society is so critical. And I hope that's something that we all collectively carry forward as an important learning from this and an important thing to cherish going forward.
Thank you. Greg?
I'm up. Okay, well, I've been thinking a lot about this, and I'm going to make kind of a prediction, or at least my hopeful prediction, and that's with the COVID-19 and this whole reset that we're going to see. I hope and expect, my prediction is that we're going to see a profound shift in the competitive landscape, not only within travel and tourism, but overall in the corporate world, in the nonprofit world, in national governments. There's going to be a shift, and the value add, the successful players moving forward in a post-COVID environment are going to be ones that know how to plan properly, to know how to incorporate effective risk management, that they have the resilience elements that we talked about a little bit and are able to adapt to change, and that most importantly, whether it's corporate, government, or individuals or even religious groups, they take a more holistic approach to sustainability. And we look at the sustainability of natural, cultural, and spiritual resources in place. And if we do that and we see that it will come back to the kind of obviously pinnacle leadership that we need, but also the really dispersed leadership where really the work will get done. That's my hope. And that's something that I think we should be very deliberate about, and we should reinforce that as good behavior and business as usual as not good behavior. And I think we will see a transformative shift as a result.
Thank you, Gregory.
Yeah, I want to share that.
Thank you so much. And I think just with that, we're a little bit over time, and I really appreciate everyone hanging on here as we wrapped it up. Lindsay, take it away.
Sure. So just want to thank all of our panelists again for joining us today and sharing their opinions. As predicted, it seems like it went by really quick and we didn't get a chance to touch on all the different topics that we wanted to, but I think we had some really good conversation. And so we really appreciate all of your input, and thank you again to everyone who joined us today as well. If you are interested in learning about some of the work that our different panelists do, we have some resources here up on the screen with links to the Climate Minute podcast, CREST, the Sea Turtle Conservancy, and Mindy Lighthite's art. And we also will be sending out an email with a replay of the webinar with some more in-depth resources for you as well. So you'll have links to all of these resources as well as some additional reading if you're interested in learning more.
Right. Just to chime in on that, we did read some articles in preparation for the webinar as a group, and we'll share those. And someone else asked for the authors that were mentioned that we'll be sure and get from you, Mariah, both Sorkin and the other author. So we'll add that in there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think with that, we can conclude the webinar today. Thank you again to all of our panelists for joining us and sharing their expertise. Thank you to those of you who attended. We hope you enjoyed the presentation and maybe learned something new. And as I said, the webinar has been recorded today, so we will be emailing everyone a replay with the links to additional information. So with that, thank you again, and we hope you have a good rest of your Earth Day.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Happy Earth Day.
Thank you.
Andre and Holbrook.
Thank you. Bye-bye.